share his information. So I'm really excited to introduce you all to Benjamin Winchester from the University of Minnesota. I honestly have had the opportunity to hear Ben present his work in these related areas on several occasions, and had the good fortune of finding out that he's nerdy about community like I am. So we've interacted a couple of times one-on-one, and it's just, he has this way of making data and thinking about this work really fun and really interesting, and thinking about the big possibilities of what we can do. And so I just am so excited that he was willing to join us today for this conversation. Benjamin Winchester, or Ben, has been working both in and for small towns across the Midwest for over 25 years. He lives in St. Cloud, Minnesota with his wife and 2 children. Ben is trained as a rural sociologist and works as a rural sociology educator for the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Community Vitality. He conducts applied research on economic, social, and demographic topics surrounding a theme of rewriting the rural narrative that are vital to rural America. He recently received the International Rural Renewal Research Prize in 2021 for this work. Winchester received his BA in Mathematics and Statistics from the University of Minnesota in 1995, and his MS in Rural Sociology from the University of Missouri, Columbia. He was a founding employee at the Center for Small Towns, an outreach and engagement program at the University of Minnesota, Morris, and specializes in community development, demographic analysis, data visualization, that's a big one, and moving communities away from anodata. I probably mispronounced that. Sorry about that, Ben. Celebrating my humanness. So glad to have you here today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Super, thanks, Patty. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you all. It's great to be with fellow extension people, like fellow lovers of rural. So I assume you are all lovers of rural. If you're not, hopefully you will be by the time we're done here today. So my name is Ben. I've been with Extension and with the university doing kind of outreach work my whole life, luckily. Been able to do this. My own background, I went to school in Morris, Minnesota, which was on the prairie. And I used to think that I grew up in a town of 25,000 people. And then I went to school in a town of 5,000 people. And I was like, oh my God, this is a small town with 5,000 people. And then I realized that actually 85% of all the towns in this country are smaller than Morris. There are all these small towns all over the place. We just don't know who they are or what they are. And we tend to use all these stereotypes and anecdotes about what they are and who they will be or what they were. So you'll notice I talk pretty quick. I'm gonna start sharing something here. But I kind of, you'll see the title here is Rewriting the Rural Narrative. And really the premise behind my life's work is that the narrative we're using to describe our small towns and rural places is terrible. And it's right out of the 50s and 60s and really doesn't reflect kind of where we are today. We're a far cry from the agricultural and extractive industry dominated economy that we had 100 years ago, or even the manufacturing focused industries that we had 50 and 60 years ago. We look very different today than ever before. So kind of walk you through this path, but you'll see the subtitle here, Speak Softly and Carry Statistics. I'm a data geek, I love data, but I know many people do not. So I've worked hard in my whole career to make it consumable. There is all the data viz people that are out there that make stuff looks really cool. I'm not that. I just try to make it consumable and understandable. So with that, my initial slide deck was 79 slides. It's been weeded down to 40. So this is going to be like skipping stones across the water in terms of hearing about the different research topics I do on. And really another way to put it is we got a long way to go in a short time to get there, in the Smokey and the Bandit kind of thing. So we got a lot of stuff to cover in kind of this presentation of this narrative. But I'll kind of walk back to where I started, and that this narrative is built for a reason. It's built upon literature. Our colleagues right in this rural industry and higher education across this country do research on certain topics that they select about rural. And what do they tend to look like? They tend to look pretty negative, right? Survival of Rural America, the decline of rural Minnesota, hollowing out the middle. You may know this book. If you don't, I'll ask you to read it so we can accurately challenge a lot of the stuff that's in there. Not necessarily challenge it, but frame it. And this Hollowing Out the Middle book is called The Rural Brain Drain and What It Means for America. And the brain drain, if you don't know, is when your high school kids choose to leave your town after they graduate. Well, according to the, kind of implication of this title, is that when the kids leave, there's nothing left. Who would possibly want to stay in our small towns, right? And we end up with stereotypes and anecdotes of things like, oh, only the lucky few get out. You got to, in order to be successful, you need to get out of this town, right? We hear this all the time. So, and in the bottom one here, from breadbasket to basket case, I mean, that was a headline like New York Times. You could not have put a more disrespectful headline if you tried, right? Like if you're a mental health professional, you're calling this whole part of the country like a basket case. Are you kidding me? So meanwhile, we have a narrative that's being written about us all over the place, not just by us, but about us as well, that we need to counter if we can. But a lot of times we don't have a counter argument. So I kind of say, like, my last name is Winchester. Like, I'm going to give you ammo to fight the negative narrative that persists about rural communities, because if you don't have the ammo, you got nothing to fight with. There's no argument against this town is dying. This town was better off 50 years ago. Of course it looks terrible. Look at all the boarded up buildings. And I think it's easy to let the visuals of our small towns dominate this negative narrative. And I'll tell you why this might be a misplaced perception. So we do have this narrative, and you look at the narrative, it's called the brain drain. Like, there's stacks of articles about the brain drain, stacks of books about the brain drain. Like, literally, if you ask your high school teachers in town, do you consider yourself a failure when your kids graduate and leave town? Certainly not. But meanwhile, we're casting this whole thing around brain drain as a negative for the town. We'll talk more about this later. And that we live in the middle of nowhere. I think it's easy for people to say that. Like, where do you live? I don't know, in the middle of nowhere, because you certainly have never heard of the town I live in of 700 people called Hancock. And people just give you the glossy-eyed look where that is. Like, I don't know where that is. So anyway, a lot of times we're just like, we just live in the middle of nowhere. There are implications for that narrative we'll talk about. We're a sleepy town, or everybody knows one another. Nobody locks their doors. None of those are true, right? I did a media study a number of years ago that looked at how the metropolitan media portray rural. And you see the sleepy town thing all the time. You see, like, oh, everybody knows one another. When you see things, and the Kellogg Foundation did a study on perceptions of rural America like 20 years ago, that when you see things like this, ideally, that's not the sign of a reporter that's done their job. That's a sign of a lazy reporter that's working upon their stereotypes, because people do lock their doors. You don't know everybody in your town, I can guarantee you. You may know of a lot of people, but how many people do you really know? It is a very small number. So nobody locks their doors, again, like people do a lot. So anyway, we have this narrative based upon what we had, what we don't have, what we wish we had, what we could have had. Like, I can't tell you how many small towns I go to that have this story in their past. Like, you know what, in the 60s, 3M was looking at coming to Morris, but the city council wouldn't rezone the land north of town, and then they never came. And now look at where we are. Why do we have stories like this in our towns? It's like a revisionist history, because Morris never did anything. 3M never looked at Morris. But meanwhile, I would argue that we have stories in our communities about these historical untruths that because our towns don't believe they are where they should be. And when you don't believe you are where you should be, you want to find a reason to blame. You want to find a reason to look back as to why we're in the position that we are, because your perception of what you are is not good. And it may not even be real. But real perceptions are reality to a lot of people. So we do have a basis for this negative narrative. The early 1900s, the mechanization of agriculture alone reduced the number of farm and extractive ranch workers by like 20 to 60% in many of our rural counties. So the rural population did go down in the early 1900s. And at the same time, roads and transportation systems were put into place where one town would be connected to another town, where before this, it was like a Little House on the Prairie with horse and buggy. And how long would it take you to get to Mankato for your doctor's appointment? The whole day. Where now you've got a car and you can be like to Mankato and back in the day. So these roads and transportation systems, and I'm not even talking about the interstate highway system. I'm talking about the very first roads. And I used to think that 100 years ago was a super long, unfathomable amount of time ago, but just 100 years ago, we built roads between our towns. And then just 50 years ago, we built interstates to connect our states even better. So this roads and transportations happened at the same time that we mechanized agriculture and we moved to a regional economy. And you started to see a rise of regional centers across this entire country in our rural areas. So now we started to lose people from the more rural communities and in the open country that are moving into these regional centers. So now, and like, here's a picture of Sleepy Eye, Minnesota. This is the Norman Rockwellish kind of, what am I going to find in rural? A full Main Street where there's people walking everywhere and there's cars. And that doesn't look like many of our small towns today. And why is that? It's because of the changes right here under that Main Street restructuring. And really, this whole Main Street restructuring is a really kind economist way of saying businesses closed. We closed hardware stores, grocery stores, apothecaries, like you name it in our small towns, bank buildings. So in this picture of Sleepy Eye right there, half those businesses are closed. And there's empty buildings. And meanwhile, we drive past these every day in our small towns. And it's a reminder that our town is not the same. And in many ways, people think it's dying because we can't hold on to this business. And you see all these proclamations at the time that if we would have just shopped more locally, we could have kept these grocery stores. Like, probably not, actually. And then if we would have shopped, if we would have kept our kids in school or had more kids, we would have kept our schools from consolidating. If we would have, so any of these kind of direct line, any of these structural changes that happen within our small towns, like if we close our grocery store, it's quickly followed up by our small town's going to die. If we close our hardware store, our small town's going to die. Like, show me all the dead towns. They're not around, and for good reason, because none of these structural changes have actually caused the death of any of our small towns. We look different. And school consolidations too happened in the 80s and 90s, where ultimately it was the birth rate. It wasn't that open enrollment or private schools. Like, the reason why our schools consolidated in the 80s and 90s is the birth rate. We're just having fewer kids. And that actually is something you have control over, right? You could be having pro-fertility days in your small towns and start to bump up our kindergarten school enrollments, right? But when I talk about Main Street restructuring, these things happen because of globalization. I can't be more clear about this. Every time you hear of a hardware store closed in a small town, there's one that closed in Boulder too, but you don't notice that because they got 3 to 5 other options within easily driving distance. But you close a hardware store or grocery store in a small town, and now it's probably your only one. And it's easy then to drive past that and be like, well, our small town's dying. We just lost our grocery store. It's just like, it is literally like one more nail in the coffin. Like, grocery store, hardware store, and our school got closed, and there's a school in the middle of all, right? So there's all of these changes we have gone through that lead us to have this narrative based upon these negativities that did happen. But I'll say this, Main Street restructuring, this is globalization. Globalization impacts everywhere. What differentiates one town from another is how they respond to it. And you know what that is? That's social capital. How well do they work together? So in many ways, I want to remind our towns that you're still here. And you're still here with all these volunteer boards. Like, you managed all of these changes with your schools, with your main streets, and you had volunteer chamber boards. You had volunteer EDAs. You had volunteer school district boards that managed all this change. And now you're still here. So in many ways, I want to pat all the people on the back who were around and managed us through all of this change, because we don't have big paid staffs to deal with structural changes in our rural communities. So part of what I just like to say is rural's not dying. It's kind of like this Mark Twain quote, or rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Like, show me all the dead towns. So rural really is changing, but it's certainly not dying. So what is happening? So the data tells us that since 1970, the rural population hasn't gone down, it's gone up by 11%. What's gone down is a relative percentage of Americans that live in rural places or small towns. So in 1970, 1 in 4 people lived in small towns and rural places. But by 2020, today, it's down to 14%. So, right, and that matters in one very significant area, and that's politics, right? That's representation. So meanwhile, when you look at headlines, especially from the metropolitan media, they will say that people prefer urban living. Right? And why is that? It's because it was, 74% lived in urban places before, and now it's 86. More people must want to live in the city. Let me put the brakes on that right now. That is not true. And there's even more playing into this. So not only are there more people living in rural areas, but what happened is the rural population growth rate was 11%. The urban growth rate was 50%. So this is where you can have a relative percentage decline, even in the midst of growth, right? So now at the same time, many of our rural communities are so successful, they become urbanized. The counties in orange are the counties that have transitioned from rural status in 1974 to urban status in 2013. What happens to my data then when I take out some of these counties? It looks like the rural population went down, when in fact it got shifted over to the urban category. They got reclassified. 25% of all counties in this country have been reclassified from rural to urban. That's not the story of rural decline. That's taking all of our success away from us. I hope this makes sense. This is like a watershed moment in terms of understanding what happens to our data. And what happens to our statistics? So what happens then when you take in, many of these counties are higher income, they are higher home value. So then I take out the higher income and take out the higher home value, and it looks like the average in rural went down, because we just took out some of the counties that are highest performing rural counties. So again, all of our data and our analysis following that looks like doom and gloom, like welcome to the doom and gloom party, just pile it on more, right? So anyway, there is this, our urban areas, and you see this in these urban areas like right, Kansas City, St. Louis, our urban areas have not grown taller, they've grown wider over the past 60 years. And especially it's our core urban counties grow wider because the people in the urban areas early on in the 1930s and 40s were like, I don't want to live in this big city anymore, I want to move out. They created the first ring suburbs. And now in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, so many more people were in the core urban area and they wanted to move out because they didn't want to be in the urban area. And then they looked out to the first ring suburbs and they're like, oh, this is just more urban. Like now they create the second ring suburbs, right? This is called the concentric ring growth of almost every urban area in this country. And you see those rings that get generated around those different areas. So we do tend to like total population, right? There's new maps coming out every year. And this is the one from 2000 to 2010. The 2020 census data is a mess, that we'll talk about that later anyway. So meanwhile, these are the maps everybody likes. And I want to call this concept, I want to introduce you to total population infatuation. We tend to be infatuated with total numbers. Like, did our population go up or go down, right? So as a data guy, they're like, oh, the new census data is coming out. Like, let's look at what happened, right? Okay, so let's look at what happened. So here's the story. All the counties that have some gradations of orange or maroon are counties that grew, and the maps look a little bit different. I think you've got losses now in the northwestern part of the state using 2020 census data, but just for a matter of fact, let's just use this map for now. That if your county is in white, that means you are a loser, right? That means you lost population. We are in a winner or loser. I call this the Ricky Bobby approach to population change. So those of you that have seen Talladega Nights, you know, Ricky Bobby is a race car driver, and he misappropriately, he remembers his father's, estranged father's words that were, if you ain't first, you're last, right? We use this in our small towns all the time, that if we're not growing, we're dying. You know, even when we talk about being stable, it's called stagnant. Like, oh my gosh, this language is so pervasive. So meanwhile, why am I challenging this? It's because, all right, losers, all those counties in white, you're all the big losers here. What actually happens to our data from one period to another is that there are demographics working against us. Sorry, I'm going to try to move this around. I'm trying out this new video thing because it feels like I'm there with you more, so I can say hi, you can actually see me. As extension people, we want to feel connected to each other. So this is one easy extension way to do that. So what has happened? So even in these places since 1940, we've had a massive change just in who lives in our households. In 1940, the average household size was 3.6. Today, it's 2.6, right? So imagine you have a finite number of homes in your small town. Say you have 100 homes. In 1940, you're going to have 360 people living in town because it's 3.6 times 100 homes. Today, you're going to have 260 people. And why is that? It's not out-migration. You are going to have a smaller population because of demographic destiny, because average household size is smaller. We don't have 2.6 kids anymore in the 49% of households that have kids. Now 18% of households have kids, and it's an average of 1.6. So now we start to weed out. When I tell communities that lose their population, you're not dying, they don't believe it. But when we look at this, we see the average household size has gone down. You're going to lose 29% of your population by doing nothing except existing in the modern world. This is modernity working upon itself. So even when I look at the population change from 2000 to 2019 in Colorado, 25% of your counties lost population. But in all those counties, the number of households was stable or grew. This is the key point. When you look at households, we're very stable. And again, I would start off, I could end this presentation right at the beginning that says rural areas are not dying, because if we were dying, why couldn't I find a house to buy? Like, doesn't that shortcut the narrative right there? If we're dying, there should be homes all over the place in all these towns, but they're not there. And why aren't they? So now, this is what happens in different time periods, and is that you may have had 2 kids in one time period. Now you're down to 1. Your population went down by 1. We have a very common scenario right now here on the bottom, where in a majority of our rural communities, we have 2 senior spouses and one of them passes away. What happens then? Your total population just went down by 1. but your occupied households stayed the same because that surviving spouse stays in that house. And we'll talk about that at the end of this too. So meanwhile, like, you can have a very stable number of homes and your population will continue to go down. Our state demographer, we call this the trickle. It is the slow trickle from our rural communities of out-migration. So meanwhile, we'll move on here. I run across this data point early on in my career that about 40 to 50% of households move every 5 years. So like, we're a highly mobile population. That's gone down in the past couple of years, but that got me to think, like, who really is moving in and who's really moving out of our small towns? So this is like literally the first chart I made, and this was for Grant County, Minnesota, but it's a little over 6,000 people, and their population in this time frame was flat. But I wanted to better understand who's moving in and who's moving out. So on the left side right here, you see that there are, if the bar goes to the left, that means people are moving out. And at the age of 20, 10 years ago, they were 10 to 14. Now they're 20 to 24, they've graduated. Grant County lost 43% of its young people after graduation. But at the same time, I was like, wait a minute, why are these bars going to the right? There are more people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s than we would expect if nobody ever moved in or out. And there was growth in the 10 to 14-year-olds, and they don't move by themselves. They're coming with their parents, right? So meanwhile, I was like, okay, here's where all the books are written, right here on the brain drain. What do I find on this in-migration? Almost nothing. And this is a real testament to how strong a negative narrative can invade our rural development industry, that we almost never look at things positive. We want to look at poverty rates or the drug use, or which are common part and parcel things. I don't know that they're ever going to be solved. This is a whole nother conversation. Like, there might be the intersection of capitalism and democracy that we have a lot to work on right now, but that's not part of this conversation. So meanwhile, we did studies of, all right, if there's all these people in their 30s and 40s and 50s moving in, where are they? What are they doing? Why did they make the move? So I first partnered in Minnesota with Nebraska on the left here, and we did the first Nebraska, called it the Buffalo Commons Research, and we interviewed all these newcomers. And we, like, even in the panhandle of Nebraska, where they're losing 10 to 15% of their overall population, they still had gains in their 30s, 40s, and 50s population. So we went out and we found all these newcomers and we asked them, why did you move to the small town and rural place? And the general profile is they're 30 to 49 years old. Some places we're getting people in their 50s. And we asked them, why did they make the move? And the three top, we just replicated this research in 2019. And then Montana replicated this last year into the pandemic. So our study in Minnesota was done a year before the pandemic. Our latest study, we've done numerous studies. And this one in Montana, you'll see some data on, was done just last year. So a year into the pandemic. But overall, we see the reasonings. When we ask people why they make the move, it's simpler pace of life, like closer to recreation, no commute. And then safety and security is number two, especially high with people with children. They want a safe environment. Kind of we kind of came out of Nebraska saying that, man, for marketing our small towns, you put a picture of your kid riding their bike on the street, and like, people from urban areas are like, oh my God, their kids are riding the bike on the street. Like, how could you ever do that, right? It is this kind of differential in freedom and what you can do. So anyway, in terms of marketing, that was kind of some imagery that always stuck out, was kids riding a bike on the street, right? Safety and security. And then the third top reason was the low cost of housing. Nowhere in the top 10 was a job, which, if you're involved in economic development, it is a job first approach to economic development. Why would anybody ever move here without a job? I'm telling you, they do all the time. And so this is really, I can't tell you how much this has reshaped how we think about economic development. Everything is on its head in this. So when we ask newcomers who moved because they had a job or a job offer, a third of newcomer households said they moved because they had a job offer and they knew pretty much where they were going. Just 25% had lived there before, i.e. returnees. That is, kids that grew up, moved away, and came back. We hypothesized that number was going to be 75% when we first did these studies, because we thought, why would anybody move to these rural communities unless you knew, that community or had some history with that town? 3/4 of new people have no previous connections there. What kind of experience do these people have? Like, if you've got a family name, that's one thing. right? And that even can be a disservice. Like, oh, Ben, you moved back here. I remember when you broke those windows in fourth grade at the school. And I'm like, I'm 37. Why are you talking about this, right? It's like, so you're trying to get past your own familial baggage, I call it. Like you're trying to be your own person in the small town. That's 25% of people. 3/4 of new people are moving into our rural communities without any previous knowledge or contact there. For me, this is the point of change in our small towns. You want to understand how our towns are changing? We need to find these people. You need to talk to these people. How are they engaged? What are they doing for a job? Like all of these things. So meanwhile, who are these people? So 91% have some college or bachelor's. All of these numbers are higher than the resident population, right? 75% have incomes over 50,000. 47% have children. We thought actually that was going to be much higher too. We thought it was going to be like 3/4 of people moving in to raise their families, whatever. Well, it's easier to find newcomer households with kids because it could be like, oh, there's a new kid in my kid's class. There's their parent, right? It's easy to see them. But I'll remind you, every time there's one family that you see, now there's going to be another household that you don't know where they're at exactly. They're not always visible to you, especially because they're not showing up at your city council meetings. We'll talk about that. So the last piece here, I'll try to sneak my way out of there. 14% are telecommuting. And that was before the pandemic. 14% of newcomer households were telecommuting. So again, this is kind of broadening our view. And this has been shaping our views for a while here in Minnesota. But I want to look at a few differentials between before the pandemic and after the pandemic. And that is people moving for a job was a little bit higher in Montana. The big one I'd like to hit on here is lived in the community before went way up in Montana. And I would argue that is because during the pandemic, it was, the housing supply in our rural communities have been super tight. It's been tight for like 10 years. This whole labor shortage and everything that urban areas are now realizing has been already active in our rural communities for almost 15 years on the workforce shortage, right? But in many ways, it's a housing shortage because I would argue that, it's hard to welcome people in when there's nowhere for them to live. So meanwhile, when I look at this indicator about who's lived in the community before, how did people find a house to buy during the pandemic? Initially, we thought, Trulia and Realtor.com, but then we started to notice some numbers were not adding up in the western part of Minnesota. So I brought together all the assessors. We have county assessors, which deal with all the property records, right? And we convened 5 counties together. We're like, hey, these numbers don't look right. It looks like they're, in some places, home sales were down during the pandemic and others were flat. We're like, no way is that true, right? And the assessors were like, oh yeah, no, this is record high numbers. The issue is home sales are not being made at arm's length. And what that means is it's not me just putting my house on the market and hope that some stranger is going to buy it. It is like, hey, Patty, I know your mom is looking at moving out of her house. We always loved her house. We're going to take you out for dinner. We're going to work out the details. And all of a sudden, we're going to just get this done through a lawyer or an agent, but it never hits MLS. Is the key. It never gets listed. So when you have 40 to 60% of your home sales not at arm's length, how do you find a home to buy? It's your social networks in our communities. And that is, we tell people the number one place to find a house to buy today is to visit with the seniors after church. So I'll just one caveat there. This is all fascinating, but again, we're skipping stones here. I can spend so much time on each one of these. So really, we started to do economic analysis too, because the idea here was that, when the narrative is around rural is kind of dominated around extractive industries or ranching, farming, like I would ask people, like, would you move out to a rural community? And the common thing I'd hear is like, I'm not a farmer or I'm not a rancher. Like, how could I? I would never do that, right? So meanwhile, we did these studies at University Extension that shows that the economy of rural Minnesota has the same diversity that you find in the metropolitan area, but it's not any one place that has a diverse economy. It's when you put 3 to 5 to 7 counties together, you get the same diversity and economy that you find in the metropolitan area, but no town is a one-stop shop. I can't even say this enough. We think we got to do all and be all in our one town. That's not how people live. So really, when I ask people, like, could you move to rural America? It's really like you can be a blank in rural America and fill in the blank with engineer, book editor. Like literally our interviews and our surveys and focus groups, we met people from every industry. Every occupation is reflected in rural America, but I don't think that's reflected in the national narrative about what's possible in rural. So we also know that people are telecommuting quite a bit. During this study, we found, 14% of respondents, 16% of the spouses, which means 21% of our newcomer households were commuting. We're telecommuting. And of course, we talk about broadband, that we in Minnesota, and I don't know the state of your broadband there, but we actually have some rural communities because of cooperatives that have very great broadband here. I had gig internet in Hancock, a town of 700 people. And then I moved to St. Cloud, town of 80,000, and my internet got worse. And why is that? It's because so when we talk about digital divide, we need to make sure that we're not saying all of rural is lacking. It's very dangerous to talk about these kinds of divides because they're proclamations of what we are and not what may exist. So really the point for me is like when you go to a hotel and it says on the hotel, like color TV inside, you'd be like, why are they putting that on there? But if you got into the room and it was like a black and white TV, you'd be like, oh, I guess I should look for the sign outside, for color TV. The same way is kind of true for broadband, only broadband is like a critical need. Many times people almost assume we're going to have some level of broadband. And when they get there, they find out it's not there. And now, because this isn't like a hotel room for a night, this is your life. So now this can actually be a push factor out. Today, we do know that we're finding more and more astute broadband consumers that are actually doing the speed test, that want to know exactly what their upload speed is in their potential new home. So if we are not advocating and pushing for some type of broadband solutions for our rural communities, we are not going to be serving our communities in the future. So really at the same time, I would hear all the time, like, well, if there's all these new people in town, like, where are they? They're not involved in my community groups. And I say, you're right. They're not involved in your groups. They're involved in theirs. And you don't know where they are. So you need to quit talking negatively about them. So here's some new data. So I use a National Center for Charitable Statistics data. They have some really cool databases, and you can all say it with me, cool databases, right? Okay. And they provide you a database of all the nonprofits in the country by county. And so when you look at the number of nonprofits in this country, I think there's an idea out there that social life is dying. It was kind of the premise behind all my early work, is that people don't want to be involved and engaged. And, and one of my basic questions was like, geez, how do we get people to just run our town? How many people do we need to just run our town? So you think about city councils, county commissioners, soil and water conservation districts, sewer districts, cemetery districts, school districts, like all of these special things. Those are all these kind of governmental agencies, but that are elected and appointed. But you also have a nonprofit sector, and they all need leaders too. We need all, and so I'm just going to kind of look at positional leadership here, right? So when we look at the number of nonprofits in Colorado, it went up dramatically from 2000 to 2010, but then it looks like it went down. So here's my big caveat, because people are like, oh, it looks like a decline. The IRS cleaned up their data. I call this the great cleanse. They cleaned up their data. In fact, over 9,400 nonprofits were removed from the rolls because they were like 80 years old and didn't exist anymore. And they never met, but the IRS didn't know it. So the IRS kind of cleaned up their database by sending a postcard to every nonprofit in the country and said, just return the postcard and prove you're here. Well, 9,400 nonprofits in Colorado didn't return their postcard. So imagine like those 9,400 that were removed during the 2010s were added back on, and you kind of see that growth rate, right? And the growth is nonprofit growth. There's not a smaller number of nonprofit groups. There is a growing number. And there's a growing number of nonprofits that end up filing full 990Ns. And if you don't know what a 990N is, every year nonprofits have to file a tax form. If you have receipts of $50,000 or more, you have to file the full tax form, like the full 1040, and I can't file the 1040 EZ, which is their 990N postcard. So the IRS has two ways. If you don't have receipts, you just file a postcard. If you have big receipts over 50,000, you have to file full taxes. Look at the proportion of nonprofits that were filing 990s. So right now, 75% of all your nonprofits today are filing full 990s. They've got more revenue. Look at the growth in revenue of your nonprofit sector. It's almost tripled since 2000. It's more than tripled. The assets of your nonprofits have tripled since 2000 to 2020. Like, I love nonprofits because as a sociologist, the types of groups that you have in your community reflect who you are, right? So if you have groups that support veterans or groups that support, animal shelters or whatever, that reflects who you are. But it's very much out with the old, in with the new. So when I get told, when I'm like, hey, you got all these new people in town, they're like, hey, they're not coming to my group. I was like, right, they're not. Like, number one, how inviting is your group ever? You know, there's all of this around like, oh, Robert's Rules of Orders. Oh my gosh, are you kidding me? I'm not coming to that meeting. Committee reports for 45 minutes. Like, I've got a whole nother presentation just on the leadership side of stuff, because it is vital that we change how we do this work to include these new populations. They don't want to sit around and listen to committee reports like, oh, I don't trust that person, I'm going to make a report in front of the whole group, right? We have to be careful about how we progress through this organizational society. We are very complex in organizational society in this country, and many of our small towns do not have that literacy to do this. And how do we form that bridge between them? So anyway, I just wanted to share some data on, I just got done analyzing this data. So here's the new data for Colorado. But really what's shifted, and what I'd like to explain is that how people like to be involved has shifted dramatically. So historically, people would be involved in place-based groups with a broad focus, like the Hancock Community Betterment Club. They didn't serve like Morris up the road. It only served the town of Hancock, right? But it did everything. It raised money for the school, it raised money for a playground or the church or whatever. It didn't matter. It was a narrow geography with a broad focus. Today, people want to be involved in just the opposite on both axes. Rather than a narrow geography, it's a broad geography. Or rather than a broad focus, it's a narrow focus. The East Central Colorado Bicycle Association. You got people from 8 counties bicycling. They're not doing everything, right? So you've got these kind of parallel worlds that are starting to be created because you don't know everybody in your small town. You don't interact with people. You know, you tend to do things with people with similar interests. Like, this is where we are. Do we know where these newcomers are engaged? When we look at the growth of our nonprofit sector too, we see growth in like education, environment. They all see growth. Like animal related, that's not the Eagles and the Lions Club. That is the shelters and the rescue groups. Like, we spend an insane amount of money and time on animals in this country. So like this has been a huge growth area. Has been in the animal related types of nonprofits. But like Eagles and Lions clubs are down here under the, which way am I pointing? No, not that one. Right here. This one right here. The one with red is the Eagles and Lions. Probably one of the only losses aside from employment unions, which is saddening in itself, right? So our communities look different. Society changes, people change. Even when you might have people, oh, do I have the slide in here? Let me see if I have this. Hold on one second. No, I don't. Like, when we use this language around disparaging the young people, I say we got to stop it. Like, this whole entitled, lazy millennials, like, don't ever say this again, because the research is showing they're starting to believe it, and it's not true. And I want to remind, especially any baby boomers here, that you were called lazy and entitled too by your parents. Like, this is a reinforcing, like, terrible little circle of viciousness we have going on about how we think the younger generation has it so easy. These people today do not have it easy. They watch their parents go underwater in their homes. I mean, all these things. So anyway, be careful about how we talk about the young people. And so when I talk about leadership, especially, it can't be like, oh, hey, Patty, you just moved into Hancock here. Are you ready to join the EDA board? Like, what did I just do? I just treated you like a warm body. I don't know who you are. Like, that's so disrespectful. Like, we're not actually taking time to get to know anybody and where their interests, passions, and skills lie. So meanwhile, here's an indicator for you. This is one of my favorite statistics I generate, which is population per organizational role. And what this is when you add together all of your government agencies by county, so your city and county officers, elected and appointed officials, together with the number of nonprofits, and standardize that, how many people does every leadership group have to tap into to look for one person to sit on their board? And I don't know your county, so please forgive me. The one right above me here, that's 10. Then what that says is 1 in 10 people need to serve as a leader in this county, either an elected or appointed position or a nonprofit leader, because of all these groups that you've got. So then I put down here, oh, you would like to begin some programming here? Like, they are so tapped out in these communities, like, oh, we're going to run a new initiative for extension. And then nobody shows up. We're like, these people don't care about this town. Like, oh man, we didn't spend any time getting to know where they were. They're so tapped out. So this is a useful indicator for us to identify not just where demands are high, but where demands are changing over time. Because if we find counties then are experiencing an increase in this leadership demand, that's where we want to offer some leadership training. But this is primarily around positional leadership. Just so you know, there's lots of different types of leadership out there. So really, when we talk about things like Rather than living in the middle of nowhere, don't we live in the middle of everywhere? And so I actually do an extension exercise called Living in the Middle of Everywhere, where we hand out a blank map and people put a star where they live and then an X where they work and an X where their spouse or partner may work. And then draw a boundary around how far in the past year did you go to shop and eat out? And it's like big, 45 minutes generally out from where you live is where you shop and eat out over the past year. So I want to talk about what this means, this kind of living in the middle of everywhere. It's meaningful, especially when we think about this demand for rural living. Now, I keep this slide in here, and you'll notice in the bottom corner here, it's from 2009. The Pew Research Institute did a study, and this is 13 years ago, that asked Americans, all right, Americans, I know that roughly, 80% of you live in the city and 20% of you live in the country, but if you could live wherever you wanted, where would you want to live? 51% of Americans said they prefer to live in small towns and rural places. And why don't they? I argue, number one, the narrative is so negative, they think they never could. So people never turn an eye even to a whole part of the country because they believe we're all dying or maybe already dead, right? Or that's, it doesn't fit in with their, high-tech life, which agriculture is high-tech, folks. I mean, we are so different than we are in the past. So meanwhile, we got these kind of nuances around this preference for rural living. We also know that tourism has a big role in this. So we did the study here in Minnesota with the Minnesota Department of Tourism it was called the halo effect. And that is when your visitors have a positive experience and are exposed to positive messaging, that they then see your place as a good place to live with increased frequency, a good place to start a career, start a business, attend a college, right? There's a direct line equation between tourism and residential recruitment and bringing people in, because the same reasons that people come to visit your town are the reasons people come to move to your town. They're not distinctly like, oh, the lake, that's just for the tourists. Like, it's never like that. So basically what we say is like, imagine, and we are in the tightest labor market almost we've known in rural communities. Labor's got tons of power. And if I'm looking for a new job, I'm going to go to 3 different communities. What's going to differentiate one job from another is everything but the job, right? Any differences in the job can be trained up on. So all of our work begins at the door of the job. The moment that person walks out of the door is the moment we need to bring them into the community as a resident, because typical economic development is a job first, employment first approach. And all they do is, here's the shop floor. I mean, some places do unique things about the community, but they really don't build upon a model that we believe would be coherent in understanding the full picture of resident recruitment. So meanwhile, just the interaction between tourism is vital. One of the questions that we asked in our newcomer survey was, do you believe the community is welcoming? And overall, like 78% of newcomers said the community was welcoming. But if we break it down by another question, which is, do you think you're going to live here in 5 years? Which, whether or not they do, we're not following up, but it kind of gets at like, hey, Karen, are you going to live here in 5 years? It really kind of gets to like, how's it going today, right? It's not whether you're really going to do it, but if you think today is going terrible, you'd be like, I'm not going to stay. I couldn't even see myself here in 5 years, right? Look at the differentials here. If the community is welcoming, 86% of people of newcomer households are like, oh yeah, we're going to be here in 5 years. But if your community is not welcoming, now we're down to 44%. This is a retention issue now, and your employers are more than concerned about this, or should be. Do they pay for any service to ensure their residents are retained? Not typically, right? So let me move up to the next slide here. So we have developed here in Minnesota a model called resident recruitment, and it parallels and is a complement to industrial recruitment, right? Industrial recruitment is the chicken or egg. Industrial recruitment is jobs bring in people, but resident recruitment is people can bring in jobs, right? It's the chicken or egg of economic development. 100 years ago, it was a one-way street. The only reason people would move is for a job, sure. Today, easily a healthy mix of the two. So really, but resident recruitment is more than just economic development and making sure the job is there, because that job might not even have to exist in your place. Then we have to do community development. And then we have to think about how tourism works into this. And part of this is what narrative is being told in your community. So, and even I kind of meant to mention this on the tourism side, like I go into many small towns and I would like go to the gas station and be like, hey, what's fun to do around here? And the number one answer you get is nothing. What kind of narrative is being told by your frontline employees? by your hotel, motel, property managers, gas station attendants. So we do have like frontline narrative writing sessions to make sure they have something positive, like just say something positive, right? You can't say one thing about this place. Like, anyway, there's plenty to say. They just need to hear it. So, because they may not live it, right? The employees may not be living a positive experience. You might have high school kids who are like, I can't stand this place. I need to get out, and they're working there. And, so be careful about what narrative you've got. So what we find though is quality of life really drives this migration. But I'll tell you, say you have, like Tulsa, Oklahoma has this whole remote work initiative. Like, hey, we're going to pay $10,000 to have remote workers come in. Well, imagine now you're a small town business owner. And meanwhile, the city is advocating to bring in these remote workers. And I've got a tight housing market already. It's like, what are you doing? Do you want to encourage people to move in and take a home that's going to be taking away a worker home for me? There are these tensions inherent in all this work as we move forward around the modern economic development that we need to recognize as the push and pull of these kinds of different tensions. So there's an article where I made a goal last year of trying to own the term resident recruitment, like it has to mean something. And it has to mean something amongst our agencies in Minnesota, because we're far ahead on a lot of this work you'll hear about. But so if you want to read that article, we're going to share with you the PowerPoint so you can have all the links and stuff like that when we're done here. But this kind of new model just leads us to think more regionally, right? Because all of the trends that you've seen up to now are regional. How people live, how people work, how people play, how people shop. We work in regional centers. Our small towns are filled. Big box retailers killed certain retail categories in our, outlying small towns. They all migrate to the, we're just more regional. But how do you then make decisions at the local level while at the same time respecting the regional reality of life? So for example, if I'm Karen, I'm looking to move into Hancock and you're the mayor, and I come up to the mayor and it's like, hey, Karen, I'm looking to move into Hancock. And you're like, you're going to love Hancock. We got everything here. We got like Buddy's Bar and Grill. We have a full K-12 school. We have a C-store / car sales / deli / hair cutter on the corner too. You're going to love this place. And I'm like, well, this is going to be great. But I'm also looking at moving to Glenwood, which is like 16 miles away, right? And I hear this very frequently because we're really parochial about this, is Karen would then say, oh, you don't want to move to Starbucks. They don't have anything going on there. This is where we have it all. What did you just do? Not only do you downplay Starbucks but you downplayed yourself, because you can't name off things around you that I might actually enjoy doing. You really are living in the middle of nowhere. We need to be able to understand that when people move to our region, they are living in our region. They will be to our towns. They will be to our assets and our resources. Maybe not every day, and we have to be okay with that. So really, I have this kind of one-stop shop here. Like no town is a one-stop shop. Like, oh, the town next to us has a library, we better get one. Like sometimes not. Like you better really, truly recognize these trends that have influenced the changes we've already went through. I hear a very common, I know you've got kind of grocery store initiatives too. I hear a very common mantra that we just need to open up the grocery store again. It's like, well, do you know why you closed? Like, are you ready to throw away a family fortune because like the demographics are completely against you here? Like, so we need to have a real conversations about why things may not work anymore. So as we move forward. Change is coming. This is kind of what I'm going to end on. Sorry, I'm probably running late. Patty, time check. I got maybe 5 minutes left, I think. Is that good?
You're a little over time, but I'm getting quite a few comments in the chat.
Okay, sorry. I'm not even like trying to catch up here.
You are great, Ben.
Okay, so okay. I'll skip through a few more things here.
Okay, sounds good.
Thanks. So really, as we look forward, again, with our this is one data point. So you see, I don't have a lot of data points in my career. It's migration, moving in and out. It's nonprofit growth or decline. It's the economy becoming more diverse and regional. And now this latest research area in the past 6 years has been around like, hey, in our most rural communities, 30% of your homeowners are over the age of 70, 30%. So we wonder like why change is not happening right now. I've got an answer on the next slide, but this point got me to think like, boy, we really better work on welcoming, because a third of our homes are going to turn over. How welcoming are we to even welcoming these new people? Are they ever engaged, involved, like any of these questions? But then not only are 30% of the people over the age of 70, again, meaning that they're probably going to move out willingly or unwillingly in the next 10 years, which I've got a whole nother presentation on housing, which is an hour and a half long. It's moving in, moving out, and moving over. And if we don't have opportunities for seniors to move over to, they move out and they take their transfer receipts and their retirement dollars with them. There's a huge economic implication to what's happening here. There's also an economic development argument why we should keep our seniors. But I would argue we shouldn't let our seniors stay in these homes because they're staying in their homes longer than any previous generation. I am literally called the person who's trying to kick our seniors out of their homes, because my argument is we don't have a workforce housing shortage. We have a lot of workforce housing. It's currently occupied by our 30% of homeowners that are seniors. So as this trickle continues, people move out, people move on, people die. Like we have to just talk about death. Like people are going to die, people are going to become incapacitated, like all of this kind of end of life stuff. But really, another 45% of homeowners are baby boomers. So all told, in the next 20 years, roughly 75% of our owner-occupied homes are going to turn over. This is unprecedented in our rural communities. Our communities ready for it. Like the leaders in our small towns of the future aren't even here yet. What kind of experience are they going to have when they first move in to even be welcomed? Or are they like, why would you ever move here? Like, people move for a lot of really good reasons. So I argue why our communities not changing quicker? Here it is. Historical home ownership rates for people over the age of 67. So typically when people retire or approach retirement, that line in green there goes down. People would move out of home ownership into multi-generational homes. And I'm not even talking about going into senior facilities. This is like independent living stuff. This is rentals, but essentially they would be moving out of their home ownership role. Today, this oldest generation today is the blue line. They're staying in their homes longer than any previous generation did. The rate of change is slow and trickling right now because these seniors are not moving out. And in fact, we've got billions of dollars dedicated to aging in their home, which might not be the best thing for their home. We need to actually have a real conversation about our houses, because our housing stock is one of the greatest assets of our communities, because without somewhere for people to live, there's nowhere for leadership to live. There's nowhere for wealth to live in our small towns. So with that, the narrative matters. The number one audience for your negative narrative are your kids. These are my kids. They know what negative narrative means. And if you have kids in all your small towns, I'm sure living in negative narrative households, that you need to get out. There's nothing for you. This town is not like what it used to be. There's nothing for you here. You need to get out to be successful. Come on. We need to move forward with a real conversation about what our towns look like today. And especially because I like to look through the eyes of a newcomer. Newcomers tell you what your town is like. So what can you do? Consider resident recruitment as a possible outcome in your marketing. Just number one, learn about newcomers in your community, because you don't know everybody. You could be pumping gas next to your neighbor and you wouldn't know it because it's dark when you get up and dark when you get home every day, right? Consider that some visitors are looking for this information already. So the bottom line is, people are moving to your small towns today for what you are and what you will be, not what may have been. So if you have a narrative in these small towns based upon what you had or used to have, I remind you that nobody is moving to your town for pity. Nobody cares where you've been. To be honest, they may come to appreciate where you've been, but somebody moving into your town that had no previous experience, that's the last thing they have time for, is to learn the history of the town. They're anxious, they're nervous, they're hoping it's going to go all right. This experience, we call it the journey. We do journey mapping of newcomers. It is a fascinating insight into how long it takes for them to ever feel, if they ever do, part of the community. So in many ways, I would argue rural revitalization is already upon us, because we've got this great rural development industry that's been doing work, and like you all and we all in extension, we're changing how we do our work to modify our programming to adapt to these times. We are not what we used to be. So I do have other slides more about the extension side of things. Like I'm big on doing presentations, right? This presentation right here. I do it in communities all across the country, and it is reinvigorating for them. Sharing narrative, and a lot of times I do newcomer panels, which is, it's one thing to hear the research from me, but it's another for the town to have to then sit there and listen to 4 to 5 newcomers talk about how much they love the place. Like, especially when they have negative narrative people in leadership positions. My strategy is get those people to sit down and shut up and listen to all these people talk about how much they love that town. It really is a core strategy in what I do. Applied research for extension. We do surveys, focus groups, data analysis, regional economic analysis. We're We're very much trying to get away from your town needs to have this and needs to have that. It is like fitting in with the puzzle pieces of economics in a regional economy. We did an economic impact of newcomers to, why should local EDAs care about this whole concept even, right? We did studies on recreational second homeowners. So you've got a lot of different rurals in Colorado too, like Minnesota. We have recreational places, we have prairie, we have pines, we have just a lot of different types of rural. So we did second homeowner studies too that looked at the transition of these second homeowners into primary homeowners and the lack of community interest in trying to involve these, because typically you have two narratives about the resident population complaining about the seasonal people, and then the seasonal people, when they finally move there, they're like, this community never cares about me. I never got an invite to the school functions. I'm never considered part ever, right? So anyway, there's all that work. Talk about business transitions too, which is important because if you've got a not dying narrative, nobody's going to buy our dying businesses. Like, oh, I've got a flower store for sale. Oh, I'm not really interested in buying your dying flower store, right? Or whatever it is. Like the businesses that we have today in rural America are stronger than ever before. We've already went through the recession of 2009. The ones that we have, so we did these studies that look at business transitions of brain gainers, people in their 30s and 40s moving in and buying businesses, and that their sales go up, their customer base goes up. Like there's all these good things that come out of this. We've developed programming. There's the whole Marketing Hometown America program was developed from my first research with Nebraska. They created this whole program. We've since brought it to Minnesota. So I'm not an extension educator in the sense I do programming. All of the programming came out of my kind of applied research, early on. So resident recruitment, Montana now did a full newcomers study. They partnered with the Montana Community Foundation. The Montana Community Foundation funded the entire survey for Tara Mastel in the community development area to study all these newcomers. They're publishing this right now. And they worked on this distributed conference model the past 3 years. And then just grants, like we're able to access grants because of these different research areas at the top level for extension. And the last slide I've got here is really for me, facilitation. We're on the ground. We hear about what is going on. If we want to better understand what's happening in communities, facilitate their meetings. Don't tell them what we need to meet about. Listen to what they're struggling with and developing programming out of that. So it really helps us keep a pulse on the conversations that are happening today. And then civic engagement, lead a dialogue about the past, the future, urban and rural, small and big, growing and dying, what that means, what our aspirations are, because we want to write our own narrative out of this. And kind of want to hit on a few things, make research consumable. You saw like slides, like I have Ricky Bobby, or all these things, like try to make connections in what you do and how you interpret this. I am not interested in academic publishing. This is my publication, is my presentation. It's, reading journal articles, and I do data analysis too on the side with single publications that, are vetted through the university, but I'm not publishing in journals necessarily. I've got a book chapter too, but it's just not of interest to me because I need my grandma to understand this stuff. And if she doesn't as a township officer, then I don't know what I'm doing here. So I also think there's a huge role for extension to improve the rural narrative and this data within the institutions of your state, within the governments, within your philanthropy circles, within your school districts, within your rural development industry, and more importantly, within your own university. And I can't say this strong enough. We used to do service learning programs in Morris, and that was, getting students involved in the community. And I quickly realized that a lot of students, when they have a negative narrative and believe small towns are dying, then they're helping out the poor rural people. I don't need your pity, folks. I want some real people who understand that their role is to help motivate and catalyze change in these small towns. You may not be the end all biggest thing here. And I frequently tell students that, your project is going to be like one sentence in the paragraph of the chapter of this town. And we have to be okay with that, right? But we're helping people along. So really at the same time, connect university staff, students, and programs with rural communities. Rural communities can be a laboratory. We had a sociologist in Morris that was doing studies on food deserts in Cuba. And I was like, we have a food desert 7 miles to the south here. So we got her engaged with Western, Southwestern Minnesota. And she ends up doing all her research here now. So getting academia to turn their attention to our rural communities as a more than viable option becomes a lot of work too. So, and the last thing I've got is a caution. If you're using 2020 census data and you want to know more about it, please reach out to me. But the smaller you get, the more troubling it is. And really, there's housing unit numbers that cannot be believed. I've been leading a team across the nation on that too. So I know you probably use census data, but oh my gosh, I'm just going to stop there. It's just, there's a lot of issues right now with that. So that's all I got, folks. Sorry, I've got a lot. Like I said, it was like skipping stones across all my stuff here. So I just want to just stop there. I did not catch up on chat at all, Patty. So
I got you. So Libby actually had a question about how you estimated the leadership demand.
Yeah, so leadership demand is assuming every organization needs 3 to 6 people. So I've got different ways to kind of calculate this. And this is, I think that number was assuming like every nonprofit needs 6 people and every government needs 5 is the estimate there. That when no, I bet you that one's 3 because you guys were pretty high early on. I'll check on that. I mean, I have very conservative estimates on that. So basically you take the number of people divided by the number of groups. But every group needs more than just one person. They need like 3 people. At a minimum, every nonprofit needs 3. That's a minimum requirement. All my early analysis, and I think the maps I generated for this, because like I said, I really haven't dug into Colorado data, so I brought up some old data I had, and I believe it's the 3 people per organization. So those numbers are extremely conservative. When you know, like Minnesota Council of Nonprofits has said the average nonprofit board size in Minnesota is 10. It's not 3. So really, you can take some of those numbers and divide them by 3 again. And it just goes to the point that, you know, you've got a full social capacity in many of our small towns. And yeah, there are people that wear multiple hats and all that, but it just looks different too. So it's 3 people per organization was my estimate. And my new 2020 model that I'm building is more like it's broken out by government has an average of 5 and nonprofits have an average of 6. So your numbers would probably be around 1 per 3 people or 1 per 3 or 4, like 2 people per city block has to serve as a leader in our small towns.
And I wonder if we can go off sharing your screen and invite folks to speak up. I know Libby, do you want to expand on your thought around leadership demand for your county?
No, I just think it kind of hits the nail on the head. And I think one of the things, so 2 parts. I was thinking about the broad topic areas of nonprofits in the past or coalitions or groups. And I think at least in our community, those folks were in the same church, they were in the same school, and so that they could coalesce around a broader set of topics because it wasn't, their overlap wasn't topic specific. Like their entire life, so much of their lives were so overlapped. But now for folks to feel comfortable coming together, they have to be so narrowly specific that that's kind of how it ends up happening. And we have, and it's causing like a divide about the continuing existence of kind of those historical organizations and them not being able to attract board members and the finances or the financial support that those other nonprofits are getting. And so there's a big shift in terms of like a sentiment that those very narrow specific topic areas on a broader geographic area are getting all of the excitement, energy, money, and focus. And so it's causing additional tensions in a very active community.
Yeah, we talk a lot about bridging social capital between these groups. So ideally, you know, the Harwood Institute, they'll tell you too, anytime these nonprofit groups struggle, instead of doing the right thing, which is look outward, they like turtle up and look inward and what can we do different without ever doing anything different. So we are very explicit about trying to do bridging programs, like finding these older established groups and connecting them with regional, because again, like some of these nonprofits are regional, they don't even exist in your town. They're like 2 counties away, you know, and then how do you find out about what people are doing and where they're engaging? So that is a lot of community development work that people hate paying for, right? This is the people work stuff. So it is like, find out where are they engaged and how can we do a joint effort? It might just be once a year, but at the same time, so again, I feel like I barely brushed on the leadership stuff, but a lot of times these newcomers too, I kind of tell it with an anecdote that even when I moved into, I went to graduate school, I moved back to the Morris area to Hancock, and there were 2 things that happened. One was there was a voicemail on my machine that said, hey Ben, this is Elgene with the Red Cross. We heard you moved back and we elected you vice chair last night. And I was like, oh, okay, that's great. I mean, I love the Red Cross. I was with them before and whatever, but that type of social obligation would freak my friends out, right? So, and the other thing, the next week, there was a knock at my door and there was a guy, he's like, hey, my name is so-and-so, I live right over there. You're in Amy and Jason's house, because it's never my house. It's like, who lived there before? You're in Amy and Jason's house. Just want to welcome you to town. I thought that was great. And he's like, well, you ready to join the Lions? And he gave me the blank stare, which of course, and I got the yellow coat. I'm like in the Lions, for a while, but I never felt engaged because it was literally like, hey, here's the 6 things we do. Which one do you want to sign up for? It's like, I don't know, I'll collect eyeglasses, I guess. Like, it was treating newcomers like warm bodies. So I talk a lot about engagement. The first step to engagement is an invitation. It is not sit on the board. It's not like join the group. It's like, hey, Libby, we're going to flip burgers for a fireman on Friday night. Do you want to help us out? It's that type of simple request, get to know who you are and that. But then when we start to look deeper, it is, all right, Eagles or Lions Club, you have those 5 things or 6 things you do. How about 1 or 2 of those things are flexible? And every year, a new person in the group defines what that means for them, because you can still have organizational missions, but a lot of different ways to get there. And so it's giving freedom and agency to new people to define what that mission means for them. Otherwise, if it's the same thing, like, I'm not coming to your group. And then we got all these JC's clubs used to be these kind of entries for chambers. And so in Minnesota here, the JC's president called me one time, was like, we have all these other JC's like newcomer, new young professional groups. What are they doing? I was like, I don't know. What are you not doing? Was my basic question. Like, yep, I don't have any answers for you, but if you want, we can do a study, or you could just start asking the question a different way. So, but I believe there's not always room for new people to define what that community means for them. We have very much you just need to learn how we do it around here. And it's the whole melting pot approach. When I would rather use the stew approach, the melting pot of America, we're just all going to blend. I don't like that at all. So it is we're the stew here, and we got people adding their things to the stew all the time. And how do you maintain their consistency and independence within that whole?
So Ben, I see another question in the chat from Martha. Martha, did you want to ask your question live?
Sure. Yeah, Ben, thank you so much. This has just been fascinating to think about across, I've worked in so many communities around Colorado. And so it's just great to have this, perspective. And I guess I was wondering, because I have my own impressions in the community in which I live, but I'm wondering if there are data, like you've talk to newcomers, 3-5 years in, and actually finding out if they do engage in their communities, and if your observations are based on feedback you've gotten from them, in a more quantitative way. I'm just really curious, because sometimes I think it seems like our newcomers are more superficial. And like you mentioned, the kind of, crossing paths at the gas pump or something like that, but they're not, we have a lot of communities where people commute in and out because the job that they hold is not within that community. So they have to commute 90 minutes one way or something. So anyway, I'm just wondering if you have any research on that. And thank you.
Yeah, we do. Definitely. We had a whole section in our newcomer survey on community engagement. So did they work on a regional project? Did they attend, organizational meetings? Do you have friends come over? Do you socialize in public? Pre-pandemic, volunteering kind of stuff. So the rates are a little bit lower, but they're, again, just different too. So like there's things like, have you ever worked on a community or regional project? Well, 52% of people said no, but that doesn't mean in terms of like the timing. So I think it was like, was it 29% of newcomers said they did. So we do have all these results on the engagement side of things too. They tend to be lower, but that doesn't mean they're less engaged. They tend to be more than willing to serve. We do find this whole theme of service almost around the move, but there is a critical point of conversation. We just had this in one of our bridging cohort programs last week. We talk about how do you do life different for free riders? For the leadership free riders, who are people who are going to let other people in town make the decisions for them. But how do you offer small opportunities for engagement that use technology or use, I just don't believe we're thinking differently about engagement enough. So even within one of our most popular leadership programs in the state, they don't teach how to use technology as a community development tool necessarily. So but as a simple example, in Hancock one day, the baseball coach couldn't make it. And he posts on Facebook hey, I need some volunteer coaches. And then 12 minutes later, there's 3 new coaches. Like how that is the best community development tool out there, right? So, or text messaging is actually the number one. But it is like, how do we accommodate not just the technology and the tools for the younger generation, but how do we organize our meetings? So getting back to the, well, I don't want to sit in this meeting. Like I worked in Southern Missouri for a long time, and there was, we had heard this comment. There was one guy who was a disruption. And the leader of the local effort kept saying, God, this guy, he keeps showing up. He shows up at every one of our meetings. And he just doesn't know when to like be quiet, but he's got his truck. So we just got to keep him around. It's like, well, I'd like to focus on what you first said, which was he shows up at every one of your meetings. Like, isn't that the important part? And not that he couldn't follow your rule. So this is where I think just so much needs to be done to help accommodate and truly understand how younger people want to be involved or can be involved and engaged and still make a difference. Because I think that's a part of it. It needs to be a valuable experience people are after. It's the process, not the outcome. People like the process of things a lot of times because that teaches you how to get there. So I don't know that I have a great answer. Yes, we have this, we have the data table. We'll actually have this book chapter out in the fall with a lot of this data in it. And we have our one-page summary. We got a NIFA grant from USDA to do this newcomer study. And then the pandemic hit and everything has been delayed in all our focus groups. So everything is, it's like, oh my God, this is academia research, which is, oh, I'm going to study it 1 year and publish it 3 years later, which is, I'm always trying to work against that. And right now I'm caught in a trap because we have an academic on our team and we need to wait for the academic stuff to get done. It's a tension within the university.
And can I interrupt real quick? Everyone, we had intentions to break into small groups, but this is pretty darn rich with just the whole group. So if everyone just wants to take off video, is everyone okay with us spending a few more minutes just doing this discussion with Ben leading as a full group? Because I feel like everyone's putting out good questions and I don't want to miss what anyone's talking about personally. And while I have the floor, I'm going to ask a question too, which I didn't put in there. So one group that this team interacts with pretty strongly at CSU is the food systems team. And that is a space where I want to put a concept out to you. So there's just a lot happening in that space, but also what you'll do is you'll have newcomers come in wanting to start a new initiative in that space. And you're right, they don't want to hear the history of what's happened, but at the same time, those of us who are long in the tooth know the history of things that have gone right, gone wrong, gone sideways. And without taking away their enthusiasm, you want to, like you said, a realism check of like, well, who's still going to be running this 5 years from now? Because it's a great idea. Let's say a community garden. It's a great idea. You're going to put it in. Who is still going to be here in 5 years? And look around, who is that? How do you encourage innovation of those newcomers to take on and own something while adding the pragmatism of the long-standing people who have seen things come and gone and get a little bit, I guess, too pragmatic about, yeah, but who's going to run it, or is it going to be a weed patch in 3 years? And that's just one specific example, but that's something we at least have run into a lot of.
Yeah, I think sometimes you just let them do it, let it fail. I mean, it's just good practice too to do community development work, as long as it's not like some major institution we're looking at and trying to change. So sometimes community development activities, they work great just to get people's feet wet in that. But I think like sometimes like I tell newcomers a lot of times, like, quit asking for permission. Just move forward with the army of the willing in your small town. Because, the whole, as a community developer, I'm torn, right? Because it's like consensus on one side or, but I'm kind of like, I'm done with consensus in some things. And I'm just going to move on. We got 5 people who want to do something. Move forward with the army of the willing. You got people with a passion and interest. Like, let's just support you along the way. I think it's the idea that they need permission. So in many ways, just giving them license, letting the town give them open license to practice or to try. I think, people are afraid of failure. My son's afraid of failure. Like it's inherent in kind of our own protectionism as a person to not want to do that and to know our limits. But at the same time, it's another thing to be like, give people permission to fail. Like, it's okay to do that. You actually have to have that kind of permission. So I don't know if there's a right answer to this. So I think, yep, with extreme, as a data person, I'm always like, is this really going to work? Like, having that criticalness is one thing, but it's another. You can be supportive and critical at the same time, I think, especially when you're in the industry that we are. We've got a lot of people with a very keen interest and knowledge of rural communities and how things work. And we actually have you all have a very large knowledge base. And we talk about this in our unit too. And that is like, what is the difference between Northeastern Minnesota and Southwestern Minnesota? We can actually have that conversation. We have that knowledge base within our staff here, but we have to actually do something with it. So I think the biggest shift for us has been, how do you introduce organizational change? This has been our institution. We've got our leadership and civic engagement, community economics, and tourism. They're all separate. I can barely get LCE to work on some of the brain gain stuff. Like, I mean, not some, especially early on. Like, what does this mean for us? Like, it's because it wasn't pitched or sold, or, it just wasn't understood what the implications of all this really are. So I think there's, and we're doing this right now in our community economic side, more specifically about these changing retail and economic structures. So we do know that, getting back to like, people don't live where they work. Yeah, you're right. Just 51% of people in Minnesota live in the county they work in. That more gets to the point that these county boundaries were drawn during a time of horse and buggy. Folks, they don't reflect like how people live at all. So meanwhile, we have these jurisdictions where we're trying to help people make these decisions in these non-conforming jurisdictions, anything natural. You might have a river or a creek or something, like defining one edge of your county, but ultimately they mean nothing. So this is, for me, the true, when I had that jurisdictional challenge slide, that's it. That's how can I get this mayor in one city to talk about the next town over positively? How can I get my county commissioners to think more broadly about environmental concerns because the ditches come into your county right there? All you guys know this, but it is this jurisdictional tension I feel all the time through some of this narrative. So I'll just stop there.
I love it, Ben. I think everyone really appreciates the energy you bring to this conversation and, bring to Colorado. So before we get Adrian's question, I want to make sure that we thank you for being here today and really being a part of this conversation in Colorado. I don't know, I've shared this with a couple of you, but Ben is really passionate about his work, but he's also passionate about extension and has bent over backwards to, share his work with us in Colorado and just wants to be a partner when it makes sense. So first of all, before people take off, because there's a big meeting that's happening at 11:30, Ben, that people will be taking off to, I'm guessing here in the next 15 minutes. Can we all just either come off mute? Just a big thank you to you for being here and joining us for this conversation.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you, really. It's certainly my pleasure.
It's great to be with a fellow colleague who really loves extension and what extension does for communities. So super appreciate you doing that. So Adrian, I noticed that you had a question. Do you want to ask your question?
Not a question, but a comment, kind of follow up on what Dawn said. I think it's in my work in extension, her example of the community garden, not a really good plan, maybe going to destined to fail. I think perhaps, and I'm new to this group, but I have done related work, especially in the realm of beginning farmers and business development startup. The ability, I think the challenge within extension work, and I've seen this in me and with colleagues, is to figure out how much of our time we invest in projects we can read up front that are probably not going to pan out very well. How much we ride along and try to advise. That whole time and effort, that discernment, I think, and it almost, to me, is analogous to being that, almost like a lender. Like you would apply for a loan and a lender is going to look at a plan and say, this has legs or it doesn't. And I think it's challenging for us in the private sector to bring that discernment forward and determine where we invest time and effort. So just to put that out there as a thought. So.
Did you want to respond to that, Ben? Or share your experience?
No,
with that? Okay. Great. What other questions do you all have? And I don't know if you saw in the chat, but Guinevere asked if you can come back and talk about housing. I know when Ben and I met and talked about what he might chat about with us today, he really did want to talk more about housing, but we knew we had to, you know, in respect to time, probably not get to that space.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do it. For me, it's the crux of change. It's hard to like change our communities without room for them to move in. And even like we're in Minnesota, we're primarily white, and most of our rural communities are from our reservations, which we have a high number of them, and the regional centers, the food processing regional centers, we have a high number of immigrants there as well. But a majority of our smallest towns have very small numbers. So, and like I just want to remind you all that like the lack of diversity in many of our rural communities is not an outcome. Like, it's not that all these people are choosing never to live in rural communities. It's an artifact of the inability for people to move in. And if there's no homes available, it's hard to welcome any change in. So, but I truly believe racial and ethnic immigration is going to be the #1 welcoming community kind of work to be done over the next 10 to 15 years. And again, through the eyes of any newcomer, it doesn't have to be a newcomer of color necessarily. I just talk about any newcomer demands respect and demands to have their voice heard. So there's, as I mentioned, there's still a ton of work to do. And I think there are more problems that are going to really rise up in many of our communities around racism and ethnic conflict, because ultimately, like, I hear this quite a bit, that our town, we're not racist in this town. We'd welcome anybody. And I'd say, well, you really haven't had a chance to be. Like, it's not, we don't really know how that looks until it happens, folks. So I think we have to be prepared for this change that's coming. And that's why I think the difference is, like, we went through in the early 1900s, like, you know, ancestral immigration, where it wasn't just all the Norwegians that were living in our towns. We had the Swedes moving in or whatever, you know, and then the Protestants were moving into our, you know, Catholic towns. Like, all those changes were dramatic too, but now it's just much more visually apparent, obviously, when you've got people of a different color moving in. So there's a ton of work to be done, but I think because we're on the front end of this, like you guys are, you know, kind of on the front end of immigration into our most rural communities, we've got a chance to do this right. We really do.
So I'm curious to the group, unless you have a pressing question, I wonder, you know, if you can either share in the chat or, you know, share your voice out loud. We'll get Ben out of the hot seat. I'm curious how some of the things that Ben shared today, how it resonated for you in your work that you're doing in local communities. Or maybe it's connected to something that you're pretty passionate about, or, you know, work that you really want to see grow.
I'll go. I was really excited to hear about that narrative rewriting. One of the things I'm interested about housing, and why I'd love to have more conversation about that, is we don't have enough housing. Short-term rentals are ruining our rural economies. I'd love to see if that data is real, and how we rewrite that. Is that a part of the economic development piece? A lot of people are making money that way. So I was really excited about that, and where that actually comes from, that desolate, dead Main Street kind of story. I didn't realize it was from the 50s, but it makes sense now that you pointed out. So I think that's a lot of the work in these smaller communities, is realizing that we're telling this story and to our own detriment. So
Thanks, Glenn, for coming off mute and doing that. Anybody else?
Well, you know, this talk leaves me with some questions about aging in rural communities. I was a little bit surprised about your perspective about, you know, kind of moving them out, and what are the solutions to that? We recently did some research on aging in place in our particular county, and looking at the hopes and fears of rural older adults and their understanding of resources. We learned a lot about social connection, and you know, understanding of resources in small rural towns has to do with you know, networks and support systems that have been in place for a long time, not the kinds of resources that you rely on if you live in an urban town. And so, you know, this is people have been there for 50 years, and they have these connections. And so what are the alternatives? And with the housing market so short, I get that, but it opens questions. I know we don't have time for it, but it's an interesting discussion.
Thanks. So yeah, definitely. That's just the tip of the iceberg for that related question, right?
Well, and to that point, because it resonates with everything everybody's bringing up on these newcomer surveys, which is a new concept to us. I don't believe we've ever done one, although Carrie, who presented at the start, they were wise enough on the community needs assessment to add that, are people aware of extension? It's not exactly the same thing, but it's a similar. If we were to start doing something in that space, because I think I saw a lot of people nodding like that'd be good to know, and we're just a state with so much churn. Do you have a thought of, Ben or others on the call, whether we should do a broadcast one that covers a little bit on a whole bunch of topics? Or like sometimes do you do those in waves where there are themes, like where the newcomer survey this year kind of focuses mostly on housing, next year it's mostly on, you know, public services, education, health, and so forth? Or because we're starting, is it just good to do a broadcast one that gathers a little bit about a lot of stuff? And because I think that's one of the things I feel like is an actionable item, and we probably should have been doing a long time ago.
Well, Dawn, can I just, before Ben responds, I'm curious too, then what newcomers consider their community, because I really appreciate Ben's perspective of maybe it's a much larger, you know, maybe it's regional and not one town that comprises an economic development area. But then what do newcomers see as their community? That I would love to know that. I think that would be so impactful for rural business development.
I was also really curious about that regional thing. And Ben, if you looked at in Montana, which is probably similar in geography, how mountain ranges and passes kind of impact that relationship and how those self-select, or what that geography does to those.
Right, as I mentioned, like you guys have a lot of different rurals like we do in Minnesota. So Montana did their newcomer survey of every county. We in Minnesota did ours in a quarter of all our counties, but we selected highly recreational, prairie counties, micropolitan, like different rurals that we had across the state. So you wouldn't necessarily have to do it all, but Montana Community Foundation paid for the whole survey. So Montana was like, we'll just do everybody. So you can easily buy a database from Info USA. You know? I mean, people are afraid of the government knowing information about them. I'll tell you, this database I get of every newcomer household tells you all these things about your individual. Do you have four-wheelers, boats, your homes, you know, what kind of fuel, home values, incomes, everything is in there. So you will, if you're interested, you can easily buy a database. I think it's like 14 cents a record or something. It's fairly inexpensive to buy a database. But the key point out of this, there are always people moving into all places. No place is immune to interest is kind of the key message here. So that there's always people moving in. Talk to your city clerks, talk to your property managers. They know this. They're doing water hookups every day. They're doing water disconnects every day. But the regional, I can't emphasize the regional enough. The parochialism of my town has to have it all is just done with me. So I'm gonna just share one thing real quick. Oops. There's just a very simple extension exercise I do that we hand out a map. So this is a map, and we ask people then to put like a star where you, like when I lived in Hancock, here's a star where I live. My wife and I both work there. And then we ask people to draw lines around how far in the past year did you go to shop and eat out? And then it's like 45 minutes away, 45 minutes away, an hour and a half away, you know, in which direction you go in. And then how far did you go out to play and recreate? This is the middle of everywhere. It's a huge playground that we play in the middle of here. So the other things that we do in this works best when you do it at the community level. So say we're going to work in one town like Hancock, we hand out this map to everybody. And what you do then in one corner, you have what is your age group, and the other corner is name 3 to 5 of your favorite assets in the region. And so what you find is that when I group them, I lay all the sheets out. So you get 100 sheets at a community meeting. You lay all 100 out by age around the room. And you notice that 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, like how big of a region they live and play in and everything gets bigger, because it goes 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, you know, you get more familiar and all that with the area. And then 70-year-olds, 80-year-olds, then you're a dot, and then your dot goes away, right? So when you age. So, but not only that, not only do you find that the region gets bigger, but then in the other corner, you have list 3 to 5 of your favorite assets. And it's not things like hardworking people. I had to make that direction because, oh, we're hardworking. Like, where are the not hardworking people? You know, like, come on. So you get all these assets. And then what you notice is the assets that the 30-year-olds are identifying are vastly different than the assets that the 60-year-olds are identifying. Then what are the implications for using this for marketing, for promotion? When I go into small towns and like, what's fun to do around here? They might point to a brochure, right? And I can pick up the brochure and be like, oh, I can tell you how old the people are that made this. How are we really generating our assets? So this is one simple extension exercise that we do that then feeds our chamber with all these assets. It feeds your frontline training program for your gas station people. Be like, hey, Greg, you look like you're in your 30s. I'm going to name off 3 to 5 things that you might like to do around here. I'm not going to name off the crochet festival necessarily, right? So it's like finding appropriate references by age. Is not the profile or anything, but generally. But this is also how you find out about new things. Because Patty goes to the West. I never go to the West, but I didn't know there was a new brewery 2 towns over from, you know, Graceville. How do you find out about new things? These exercises, we replicate them year after year in some places just to update the list and see what's new.
Well, I love this conversation, and I love having this opportunity to really dive into this a little deeper. For all of you, we will definitely be continuing this conversation in May. We're really hoping to not only involve the folks who are here and our other extension colleagues, but also bring together some of our faculty partners in addition to David, who is here, but bring some of our faculty partners from the civic centers on campus who do engage work out in communities and really explore this topic more. I know that several of you are probably headed to that 11:30 conversation. So I want to again thank Ben for joining us today and really bringing some great energy and some great work that he's been doing across our country around rural areas. And just thank you, Ben, so much for being here today. I will share the slides and notes from today, plus the recording, and invite you all, as you leave the meeting today, I wonder if you would be willing to share just one word or a phrase that's coming up for you about, you know, this conversation today. So, you know, are you feeling connected? Are you feeling energized? Do you have more questions? Like, give us a sense, and, you know, give Ben a sense of where you're leaving this conversation today. I see lots of thank yous. Perfect. Intrigued. Thanks, Sue. Knowledge, more insights, dynamic. Need more coffee? Oh, wait, that was me. That's fair. Energized, but have more questions for sure, right? That's what we do in extension. We ask questions.
Yeah, and we're very sorry we didn't stay on agenda today, but to the spirit of what Ben said, we don't always have to do what we usually do. And if the group needs it to be a different dynamic, me and Patty are not standing in the way of that. So I hope you guys felt it was a good use of your time today. And again, if you had hoped to hear some updates on the agenda, we're sorry we didn't get to them all, but we feel like this is, I think, what we all needed right now. So
yeah, absolutely. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Thanks again to Ben. And if you have any questions or want to dig deeper prior to our meeting in May, please reach out to Don and I. We're happy to talk about different ways that you can engage in this work and collaborate and think about this work in a deeper way.
and again, keep your eyes out. It looks like Rural Initiative hires will be initiated this week. And we need you guys to get word out.
Nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.